Hey guys, Mrs. Severson here. Get ready for your first video lesson of the year. Today we're talking about some of the things that led to the colonists deciding to write the Declaration and leading to the Revolutionary War. So before I can really dive into that topic, I have to talk to you first about this little thing called the French and Indian War, which is very confusingly named because it is not, in fact, a battle between the French and the Indians. It's a battle between the British and their colonists, as well as the French and the Indians on the other side. So I know it's a little bit confusing, but I have to talk about this war before we can get into anything else. And it'll be clear why in just a second. So the British and the French were extremely interested in the Ohio River Valley for fur trade purposes. Obviously, money is always king in these instances. So the French decided, in order to protect their rights to have the fur trade in this area, they would build this giant line of forts to kind of keep the British at bay and sort of establish their territory in that area. So during this whole time, the British are obviously very upset by this because they think the French are, challenging their authority in North America. They were fine with the French being up in Canada or in Louisiana, but not so much encroaching on their British colonies. So Washington, at this point, obviously not president because we didn't exist as a country, but he was a very prominent war leader, and he's a very good general. So they sent him in to try and force the French out of their forts. Obviously, it didn't work. And then at this point, fighting expanded to England and France on that territory. So in order to try and help the British, the colonists actually went to various Native American tribes to get some help. The biggest one that they approached was the Iroquois. I don't remember if you can kind of think back this far, but the Iroquois was a huge nation. There were 5 different tribes that were kind of banded together in this area. The American colonists' goal at this thing called the Albany Conference that they held with the Iroquois was to try and get the Iroquois to ally with the British against the French. They figured if the French could get as much help from the Native Americans as they had, maybe if they had the Iroquois on the British side, it would be a big help. It obviously didn't work. But at least the Iroquois decided to remain neutral. They weren't going to fight with the French either. So that was kind of a, hooray, hooray. And then they proposed, Ben Franklin was the one that proposed this, the Albany Plan of Union. The idea was that if they united the 13 colonies into one big federal government, that they would be stronger to help the British. It didn't work, but it, obviously because we didn't unite until later. But it really started getting the colonists thinking about kind of working collectively as a group. So, win there. Eventually, the British were able to kind of cut off the flow of supplies into the French troops using their resources in the colonies. The Iroquois started pressuring other tribes that were fighting with the French to stop fighting with them. The only little snag in the British plan here was that Spain decided to jump in last minute and help the French, but they still lost. So the British had too many resources. They were too strong. So in the Treaty of Paris, it was decided to end this war. The French lost all of their Native American territories in what is present-day United States. They kept their lands in Canada, and everything was fine there. And then the Spanish, because they jumped in too, ended up losing the little section of Florida, if you can see at the bottom of the map. So Spanish and French lost a bunch of territory, and the British had it. However, what is wrong with fighting large wars like this? They cost a lot of money. Okay? So hence leading into our discussion now of kind of how things became really tense between the British and their colonists. So the British colonies were upset with the fact that the British negotiated a treaty with the Native Americans after the French and Indian War, saying that the natives would get to keep their land. Obviously, non-landowners in the colonies wanted to expand and actually become landowners, and the only way that they could do that was to push into Native American territory. So the Native American tribes that had, had a deal with Britain and were like, hey man, come on, they were upset and they banded together to attack the settlers that were moving into the western frontier. So the British king, King George, he was obviously very upset by this. He said, hey, I had a deal with these people, and, we're just not in a position to fight any more wars, so you guys in the colonies need to stay where you belong. So he issued this red line on the map, if you can see it, called the Proclamation Line of 1763. He said the colonists could not pass that line. That is not our territory. Do not expand further past it. Obviously, it's like drawing a line in the sand for a toddler. That's the first thing they want to do is cross it. So the colonists were really angry by this. This is kind of the first sort of nail in the coffin of conflict. The second problem that they had was after the British were done fighting with the French, they started kind of taking back their control of the colonies in all areas and specifically in trade. So customs reform means that they're changing the way that they have laws on the colonists for trade. So the colonists were even more angry by these laws because they were already heavily taxed by the British in terms of the fact that they weren't allowed to make more than a certain percentage off of trade with anybody else. They were only supposed to trade with Britain. So Britain put new taxes on the goods brought out of the colonies, obviously in an attempt to get more money to pay back their debts from the French and Indian War. So the colonists' response was, okay, well, if you're going to do that, well, then we'll just smuggle goods through your line of ships and not pay you. So obviously some tension here. So the British responded to the smuggling with making these vice admiralty courts, as they called them. They're military courts in which there were no juries. They were headed by members of the British military. So if you were a smuggler, a colonial smuggler, basically don't expect any sympathy. You're going to be sent to these vice admiralty courts and, killed or stripped of all your property. Obviously, the colonists thought that this was definitely a violation of their rights, and this was, furthering tensions. So then to add more sugar to the wound, I would say salt, but this is the Sugar Act. The British then started taxing new things because they were trying to make up for the money lost when people were smuggling. So they enacted a tax on sugar, molasses, silk, wine, coffee, and indigo. Indigo is like a plant used in blue dyes. So the colonists obviously hated it because it hurt their trade prospects. It hurt on all of their commerce. They were accused of smuggling constantly, even if they weren't. And the British would just take their goods and not compensate them for their loss of materials. And then colonists weren't even allowed to file suits, lawsuits to get that money back. So this is what kind of sparked the idea of colonists saying no taxation without representation. So then several months later, the British are kind of at it again. They need more money to continue to pay off their debts. So they instituted a tax on printed materials like newspapers, wills, deeds, basically all legal documents, things like that. The problem with that is, do you really want to anger the people writing the stories in the newspapers? Not ever a good idea. So the colonists were very upset because this was the first direct tax on them that the British were definitely not paying because it didn't have anything to do with trade. They felt like they weren't getting the same rights as other British citizens and having to pay for Britain's debts for wars that, they necessarily didn't have anything to do with. So the way that they kind of fought back against this, there was kind of several prongs involved here. So the colonies passed these resolutions saying that we're not going to allow ourselves to be taxed unless we have representation in British Parliament, which is their government. They created groups like the Sons of Liberty, which tried to sort of intimidate stamp sellers and sort of steal stamps and things like that so that they wouldn't have to pay the taxes on them. Not super effective, but at least it sort of formed the idea to the British that they weren't just going to take this lying down. They boycotted British goods. They sent a petition to the king for their rights, saying, these are the rights we need in order to be happy and feel like citizens. And then they instituted these things called non-importation agreements, which basically means that even if the British brought their goods to the United States, not the United States, but the British colonies at this point, the colonists would refuse to buy it off of the British ships, so they just have to turn right back around to Britain and try and sell it somewhere else. So in response to this, obviously the British were extremely upset with the colonists and said, okay, fine, you want to act like that, then we're going to punish you even further. And then they started taxing things like lead, paper, paint, glass, and tea. The tea being a huge one because that was sort of, something that the British and the colonists together shared as a cultural thing. And, they were really upset by the fact that the British thought that they could tax something so everyday to their lives. The Townshend Acts also allowed soldiers to take over colonist houses and sort of just decide to live there if they so chose, and didn't have to pay the colonists for any of the goods used or anything like that. It took away their right to trial by jury and their right to their property. So if the British, thought that for whatever reason they were a resistor, then they could take over or seize their private property. So the colonists responded with more boycotts and more non-importation agreements. So what ended up kind of finally bringing this whole thing to a head, after the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, all the customs reforms, the smuggling things, nowhere more in the British colonies than in New England, and specifically Boston, were tensions this high at this point. And if we remember back to our discussion of the different regions of the colonies, obviously New England was the one that felt more like it had the most control over its own government. So it makes sense that more of these resisting activities are coming from this area. So a lot of the basically like high-minded colonial leaders lived in or around Boston. So they're kind of spouting these ideas that, let's just resist the British as much as possible. So tensions really rose in Boston very high, enough to have King George send British troops to keep it under control. So the colonists one night decided they were going to start provoking troops. Things were getting really tense. They're kind of poking at them, throwing snowballs at these troops, yelling at them, calling them names, things like that. Things end up getting really tense. The British are kind of jostling back and forth and trying to intimidate the colonists. Ends up that somebody fires a shot, and then that starts off a whole volley of shots and killed about 5 colonists. Now, 5 people dead is obviously never a good thing, but does that usually warrant the term massacre? Not necessarily. So how this ended up being portrayed as the bloody massacre in Boston was, remember, don't anger the people that write the newspapers. They played this up as, oh my goodness, these British are running rampant. They're just randomly shooting at colonists that weren't doing anything to them. They're these tyrants. They're willing to kill their opposition no matter what. So they're making this, into maybe a bigger deal than it should have been. But that's kind of a reflection of how everyone was feeling at the time. So in response to this, the British sort of apologized and said, okay, we'll repeal all these taxes except for the tea tax. So they left the tea tax because, like I said, it's an everyday part of their lives, so it made a lot of money for the British. But actually things started to settle down. Peace kind of came back to the colonies, and things were okay at this point. They were not wonderful, but they were okay. So things sort of settled down after the Boston Massacre. So hopefully that all made sense to you. Hopefully I didn't talk too fast. I tried to keep myself slow it down. If you guys have any questions, just email me, or just go back, pause, and rewind as much as you need to get all of the concepts that you need from here. Okay?